So this evening we have a really important panel presentation. 2 weeks ago we launched this series where we discussed the history associated with the development of this particular federal legislation and its impact over the first 25 years, and had Dr. Joe Watkins and Mr. Regis Pecos of Coche de Pueblo who joined us for that presentation. And this evening, the panel presentation is concentrated on the impacts that this law has had on the tribal communities. And as you heard last week from Regis Pecos, who delivered such an important message, there are many, many challenges that tribes are still facing relative to the implementation and use of this law. So this evening, our distinguished panelists and our moderator this evening will talk to these issues, and we're very, very pleased to have everyone who is on the podium this evening. And I want to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. T.J. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is a professor in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. He also owns a company called Anthropological Research, which is a research company based in Tucson that specializes in archaeological and ethnographic research that is needed for historic preservation, repatriation activity, and litigation of land and water rights. Dr. Ferguson holds a Master's of Community and Regional Planning and a PhD in Anthropology from the University of New Mexico. For 3 decades, Dr. Ferguson has conducted archaeological, ethnographic, and historical research of Pueblo and Apache tribes throughout the Southwest. He has also authored 4 different books, a Zuni Atlas, Historic Zuni Architecture and Society, an archaeological application of space syntax, and History is in the Mind, a multivocal tribal traditions in Arizona's San Pedro Valley, and finally, the Moki and Katsinam, Hopis, Spaniards, and the Trauma of History, Volume 1. Dr. Ferguson has also authored a number of articles and chapters in numerous publications in archaeology and cultural landscapes of the Southwest. So at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for coming to our panel discussion tonight. We have a distinguished panel with us, and if I gave everyone's full curriculum vitae, we'd take the whole hour and 15 minutes, and we'd never get to the discussion. So I'm going to keep the introductions relatively short, and I'll start at the other end of the table. We have Mr. Mark Mitchell, who's the former governor of the Pueblo of Tesuque, where he also served as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and he remains active in community affairs. We have Theresa Pasqual from the Pueblo of Acoma, where she served as the director of their Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and she's currently a member of the advisory board to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She's an independent consultant. And then next to me we have Dr. Rosita Worl, who has her PhD from Harvard University in anthropology. She's also the president of the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute that we hope to hear more about during the panel. She's on the board of directors of the Sea Alaska, which is a Native corporation, and is also co-chair of the Alaska Federation of Native Subsistence Committee. And probably most important for this panel, she served 4 terms on the National NAGPRA Review Committee. That was 12 years, 10 of which she was the chair of that committee. So she's quite knowledgeable about NAGPRA at the national level, as well as the level of her community. So I thought I'd start our panel discussion tonight with just a short. And about a year after NAGPRA was passed, I went to an American Anthropological Association meeting and was standing next to some very senior anthropologists, listening to them talk about NAGPRA. these senior anthropologists were saying that they thought NAGPRA would be done in 2 or 3 years. It was a pretty short-term project. There would be claims, there would be repatriations, and then it would be over. Well, here we are 26 years later, and we're still grappling with NAGPRA at every level in our country, the national level, the local level, and other levels as well. We know a lot about the challenges that NAGPRA presents for museums. A lot of museum people write about this. It's an unfunded mandate. There's a lack of funding to do the work that's necessary for repatriation. There's coping with the poor museum documentation over the last century and a half and trying to set out the facts for repatriation cases. There's trying to balance the scholarly commitment to disseminate or share information with the need for communities to keep that information confidential. There's balancing this the scholarly commitment to strive for scientific certainty in our work with the standard for repatriation in NAGPRA, which is less than scientific certainty. It's a preponderance of the evidence, and that a lot of people struggle with. So we know a lot about the challenges that museums face, and that leads me to the first question I'd like to pose to the panel, which is, what challenges do your communities face today as a result of repatriation, and how are those being negotiated?
Good evening. Before I get started or answer the question, I just wanted to welcome all of you to the ancestral homelands of Chisuki Pueblo. The traditional name for this area is Ogapogi. So, welcome to Chisuki Pueblo, ancestral homelands. On our end, on the tribal side, when it comes to repatriation, the Pueblo of Chisuki, we've gone through issues such as where are we going to gather the funding to take care of these items? If they're if they have pesticides on them and what have you, how are we going to clean them, and can we clean them? Was the answer on our end. Then the question then becomes, should we get them back? Should we bring them home? Yes or no? Because in the Chisuki world, certain things are considered quote unquote sacred, and once they leave the pueblo, or if a certain individual passes away and it becomes a funerary item, object, we don't have another way of reinterment. So for us, those are some of the issues that we're faced with. We currently have a few items up in Colorado that are on hold. We're wondering how we're going to bring them back because of the issue that I just explained. It's pretty much complicated if you're not native. I don't understand if you all understand what I'm talking about. But it's an issue where 20 some years ago, this NAGPRA law came into play, and we at Chisuki would much rather have those remains stay in their place where they're laid to rest. So there's a lot of issues that we're looking at as far as, you know, what kind of current laws would help protect these prehistoric, historic burials. Matter of fact, this discussion happened about 2 weeks ago regarding certain other issues that we were facing. So when it comes to that, how do we, or should we, change the law? Because on one hand, it sounds good that we can, that there's a process, but yet then, on the other hand, where do the tribes sit when it comes to repatriating these items? And in some cases, is it even acceptable back to the tribe because they've gone out already. And so those are the dilemmas that we look at. And how do we, if we're going to do this, I think we need to look at a resource so that we can take care of them the proper way. Now, putting it back into use is pretty much against our unwritten law. And in some other tribes, they're putting them back into use. But as far as Tisuki is concerned, we can't do that. Hopefully I answered your question.
Good evening. Based on my experience in working with the Pueblo of Acoma, the things that we saw firsthand in terms of the challenges really had to do with, as TJ alluded to, that there is not very much funding that comes with having to then comply with the law, at least on the museum or institution side. Federal agencies are already financially strapped, and so they too are also facing the burden of having to comply with this law. On the flip side, when we're talking about tribes and pueblos specifically too, we see that many communities don't have offices set up that handle specific NAGPRA issues. And so the burden is also placed on tribes and communities to then respond to the numerous requests that are coming into the governor's office or coming into those communities that are very fortunate to have TIPO offices or preservation offices. Usually someone there is staffed to handle the response back to those NAGPRA consultation letters, but they are numerous because every institution is trying to meet the compliance regulations with this particular law. And so everybody is trying to consult with the tribal communities as to whether they have affiliation or whether these items, the cultural items, funerary objects, are of significance to a community. So there are challenges, obviously, with funding and staffing issues that we see. When we do have remains that come up, and again, this has been my experience in working with many Pueblo communities here in New Mexico, is that oftentimes the remains that we see aren't distinctly tied to one community, especially if we have remains that were exhumed for research. They were probably in areas, ancestral homelands that were claimed by multiple tribes and communities. So you have to remember, you know, thousands of years ago, we had many tribal communities that were using the same landscape. We weren't confined to the boundaries that we have in present day America. And so many of these remains that were being exhumed for collection, for research, what have you, come from ancestral lands in which there were multiple tribes. And so you can't definitively say in certain instances that these remains were either Tisukis or Acomas or Lagunas. And so you may have an instance where you have multiple pueblos or multiple tribes make multiple claims for those remains. And so it requires a longer process than to see who has the stronger claim. Also a longer process in which to see if tribes can work out a solution in which they make a multiple claim for those remains. And then ultimately, where then do those remains become reinterred? We have found with our experience that federal agencies, through their various policies, will only take human remains that can be determined to have been exhumed from their particular boundaries. So Forest Service only takes what's in their boundary areas. Park Service also takes only what's in their boundary areas. You can't take remains that were found outside and placed them within federal lands. Here in the state of New Mexico, and we see the state SHPO officer in the audience, and he knows this well, is that here in the state of New Mexico, the tribes realized that we had remains that were affiliated with the Pueblo and Southwest tribes here of New Mexico. And so what we sought then was the passage of the State Reburial Act. And part of that passage of that act here in the state of New Mexico was then to set aside a piece of state land in which these remains could go when they couldn't be reinterred on federal land, on specific state site land, or they couldn't be reinterred on a tribal piece of land either. So it would give us a fourth alternative. As of today, we still don't have that in the state of New Mexico, and there are many remains that remain housed in institutions where we've gone through the process, but we haven't been able to bring those remains home completely. Lastly, I would say that the challenge that we see is also when, as Dr. Ferguson noted, when there is a lack of incomplete records. At Acoma, we were working on a particular case in which only the heads were exhumed from the individual bodies. The craniums were sent to a dental institution for research. And so the remainder of the bodies were left in the field, and what we lack then is the documents then to tell us where those remains were, where those craniums were exhumed from. And so it forces a very heavy emotional and ethical burden on the tribes as they move forward to send these individuals on their journey. How do you create a process then to repatriate simply only the heads of these individuals? And we speculate a little, because how do you make that individual whole again to send on their final journey? And so it creates a very emotional and ethical burden that now the tribes have to carry. And I don't think probably 50 years from now that it will probably be 50, 100 years from now that we finally look back and say, really, have we healed the trauma that we have caused after all these many years of research?
In honor of my ancestors and in love for my children, I am required by our cultural protocols to introduce myself. But before I do that, we are also required to give thanks to the people whose homeland this is. And I want to acknowledge the Tusuki people, that this is their homeland. This is their homeland. And I feel very privileged to be here in their homeland. We've had people who come to Alaska and to my home, and they could feel the spirits of our ancestors in our homeland. It's the same when I come here, that I could feel the richness of this place, the spirits that are in this homeland. And so I have to thank the Tusuki for allowing us to be here. And I have to thank them for allowing my daughter and her partner to live here. Every time that I have come here and I am in a position like this, I always give this thanks. So Gnochish Anyat Kusani. Ye deklatsak kakahani yuhatu asak. Jakna ayachat. Shangu Kwedi ayachat. Kauli ayahit ayachat. Just had Kwan ayachat. My Tlingit names are Yedeklatsak, is an ancient name whose meaning has been lost in time. And my ceremonial name is Kahani, and it means woman who stands in the place of a man. And I always remind my fellow board members of that name. I'm an eagle, and I'm from the Thunderbird clan, and I am a child of the Sukhakati, my father's clan, the Sockeye Salmon, and I am from the House Lord from the Sun, and I am also a Chilkat Kwan. Those are the cultural protocols that we are required to do when we introduce ourselves. There's so many things I could tell you about NAGPRA. As TJ said, I sat for 12 years on that NAGPRA board. And I will tell you, wherever I went across this country, I heard Native Americans talk about their ancestral remains. They wanted to bring their ancestral human remains home. And always there was controversy over the return of human remains. I had actually thought that the public would become more sympathetic, after 9/11, when we as a country did so much to try to identify and reclaim and all of the human remains that are relatives who were lost. And I kept thinking, surely, they'll understand how we feel about our human remains. But if we looked at the inventories, we would see that very little yet, a small percent of the human remains have been returned. And you heard some of it comes from the problems. They always said that NAGPRA was, I wrote this paper, NAGPRA, Treaty of NAGPRA. It was supposed to be a balancing act between the needs of science and Native Americans. I didn't see the balance myself, because it seemed to me it's always a struggle to get your ancestral remains home or to get your sacred objects home. You cannot believe the contests, the disputes that we've had around the definition of sacred. And I don't know if I kept thinking, it's because they don't believe that the spirits reside with the human remain. They don't believe that spirits can be contained within objects or are affiliated with objects. When NAGPRA was first enacted, we had meetings at home, and we called together all of our clan leaders. And I tried to explain to them cultural patrimony. Cultural patrimony. What is this cultural patrimony? And when I tried to explain it without putting words in their mouth, I said, it's a'u, it's our a'u, it's our clan object, those objects that are owned by our clans. But they also have sacred dimensions to it. They have the spirits of our ancestors. They contain the stories. An object has so many property elements to it, if you want to call it property elements. But they have all of these dimensions to it. So we had to figure out what cultural patrimony was and how do we make that fit with our clan system. And so after we formed the Council of Traditional Scholars to help guide us, and we would have long discussions about bringing things back home, and we had to try to write things to fit the law, but yet also that would fit our cultural beliefs. And in our society, we have eagles and ravens. And so if we had a human remain and we were not able to identify, was that human remain an eagle or was it a raven? We didn't know what kind of ceremony to do. So we would end up we had to make up a new ceremony, and where both of us acted both as the host and as the guest. We had to go through so many of these kind of deliberations. And our Council of Traditional Scholars would say, how much change do we have to accept before we are not Tlingit? That is, every time that we deal with an issue where we're trying to change, or have our laws and our cultural belief systems meet with Western law, we have to make so many accommodations. We have to make the accommodations. The other issue is money. I mean, it is an unfunded mandate. I know that the museum professionals and scientists believe that once NAGPRA was enacted, that Native Americans would be coming up to museums and with their trucks and unloading museums. That's not been the case, I can tell you that, you know. And I have served on museum boards, and I will tell you that is not the case. One of the issues we have are disputes. And under the law, you can bring a dispute against a museum. I will tell you, in one case that we brought to a dispute before the NAGPRA Review Committee, it cost us $100,000 for 30 objects. And it was funded not by NAGPRA, but by our corporation. And you heard I'm on a board of corporations. When we settled our Aboriginal land claims, we formed corporations that would hold our Aboriginal lands. And I might say that we only got back 2% of our land base. And so we were able to, but because of the corporation, and it is a native corporation, and so this native corporation was funding a lot of the work that we do. And wouldn't you know it, we were declared ineligible. I know where that came from. I know where the issue of were we eligible under NAGPRA to file a repatriation claim, I know where it came from. And it went up to the Solicitor General. We had all of our lawyers look at it, and we saw that it could have gone either way. But what happened was they ruled against the Alaska Native corporations, and so we were not able to be involved in NAGPRA again. But I will tell you, we didn't stop there. We have an amendment so that we can be deemed eligible again. We are a Native corporation, but we're also a tribe. We're very culturally based. It took us, we just finished trying to get our final entitlement from Congress, our final land entitlement. It took us 10 years and $10 million to do that. We also had an amendment into NAGPRA that would restore our eligibility. But because we were so focused on trying to get our land, our home, parts of our land back, we had to hold that NAGPRA amendment in the back. Because we knew our delegation wouldn't deal with it as long as we had our land legislation there. So now we have that back on the table, and you know, it's again, we'll probably end up having to spend a lot of money to do that. But because we are a corporation, a Native corporation, as a Native, we will dedicate money, you know, to these kind of cultural issues. We continue to struggle, you know, to try to get museums to comply with NAGPRA. I don't know if any of you heard very recently about the Andover Newton Theological School. They were trying to sell a collection, over 100 objects. And I wrote a letter and said, have you complied with NAGPRA? Because we didn't see these on any inventories or summaries. And they said, oh no, we're not subject to NAGPRA. And we had to mount, you know, a claim and say, yes, you are. And I have a stack of papers on my desk about this high of just correspondence going back and forth with Andover, trying to persuade them to do the right moral and ethical thing and to comply with their mission statement. I mean, where they said that they would respect the beliefs of everyone. And I would say, please respect the beliefs. You know, we need this sacred object home. We have a lot of different kind of struggles that we go through, and some of them are internal. We had to decide whether we were going to repatriate shamanic objects. And some of our tribes decided not to, but we persuaded those tribes, you know, don't, you know, just say you're not going to do it for this generation because that tribe is a Christian. And they hadn't resolved the issues between Christianity and being a Tlingit and having Tlingit beliefs. Some of us have resolved that. My grandfather used to say, God made the Tlingits and God made the Tlingit beliefs. And so it was okay for us, you know, to try to get our shamanic objects back. But the belief systems around it said that we couldn't use them. And I will tell you, that was part of the collection that came back from NMAI up to the Anchorage Museum. And they wrote us and asked, could we use it? And we initially had to say no. But our younger people came to our Council of Traditional Scholars and said, well, that's not right. And they said, Rosita, you're the one that always says all cultures change. And it's not right if we cannot even see these objects. And we just want to be able to see it. And so they persuaded the Council of Traditional Scholars to change their position, but then they set out a whole list of cultural protocols that the museums have to comply with in order to be able to exhibit for educational purposes. So I will tell you, I could go on and on about the challenges of NAGPRA, and hopefully we'll be able to talk some more about some of the other kind of stuff that we're doing.